The moment I handed a stranger my umbrella, I had no idea I was handing him something else entirely. It was a Tuesday in October, which in Vancouver means the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as materialize. Suddenly, completely, as though the sky just gives up pretending. I'd just finished a double shift at St. Clair's, the community health clinic on East Hastings, where I worked as a registered nurse. My feet were aching. My hair was already frizzing at the temples. I had exactly $22 in my checking account until payday Friday, a bag of groceries that included one sad bunch of kale and a box of PC macaroni, and absolutely zero patience left for anything unexpected. The unexpected happened anyway. I was standing outside the clinic's side entrance, trying to get my umbrella to open, the cheap telescoping kind that always jams after 3 uses, when I noticed him. He was standing maybe 4 meters away, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my rent, completely still, looking at his phone. The rain was soaking through his jacket, and he hadn't moved. He wasn't scrambling, wasn't cursing, wasn't doing any of the normal things people do when they get caught in October rain in Vancouver without an umbrella. He just stood there like the weather was a minor inconvenience he'd decided not to acknowledge. My umbrella finally clicked open, and then, I still don't fully know why I did this, I walked over and held it above his head. He looked up from his phone. I said, "You look like you've decided to be dramatic about this." He blinked, just once. And then something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite not one either. And he said, "I have a car coming. In this traffic? On East Hastings? On a Tuesday?" I looked at him. "So you're going to be standing here for at least another 12 minutes. He put his phone in his pocket. He looked at me the way people look at something they weren't expecting to find interesting. "Sloan," he said, not asking, just as though he was trying it out. "That's my name. Sloan Adler, 29 years old, registered nurse. Person who gives strangers her umbrella in October because apparently her mother raised someone with no self-preservation instinct." I didn't find out who he was until 3 days later. I should tell you a bit about St. Clair's, because the clinic matters to this story in a way I didn't understand until much later. It's not a flashy place, it never has been, Doctor. Margaret Chu, no relation to the list of names I won't use, founded it in 1991 with a grant and a borrowed photocopier, and for 30 years it had served the east side of Vancouver, low-income families, recent immigrants, people who fell through the cracks of a system that isn't as universal as we like to pretend. I had been there for 4 years. I knew every creaky floorboard, every patient who came in every Thursday for their blood pressure check, every corner of the break room where the fluorescent light buzzed like it was slowly losing its mind. I loved that clinic the way you love things that are imperfect but yours. Which is why, when the rumors started that fall, I couldn't sleep. Kavanaugh Capital bought the building. Our receptionist Bev told me one morning over terrible coffee. She was 63, had worked at St. Clair's for 19 years, and had the energy of someone who had decided not to be tired until she was dead. The whole block, apparently. They're putting in mixed-use residential, whatever that means. "It means condos," I said. "It means we're out," she said. I told myself she was being dramatic. I told myself this for about 4 days, until I came into work one morning and found a notice on the staff bulletin board from clinic administration. A meeting had been arranged with a representative from Kavanaugh Capital to discuss the future operational structure of St. Clair's Community Health Center. Corporate language for, "We'll be nice about it." I went home that evening and ate my macaroni and stared at the ceiling and thought about Mrs. Okafor, who was 71 and diabetic and had been coming to our clinic every 3 weeks for 7 years, and who didn't speak English well enough to navigate most other medical offices. I thought about the 17-year-old I'd seen last week, who'd come in alone, no parent, needing something she couldn't ask for anywhere else. I thought about all of it, and I was furious in the specific way you get furious, when something is happening to good people and there's nothing obvious you can do. I didn't connect the man in the rain to any of this. Not yet. His name was Adrian Kavanaugh. I found out the way you find out things you weren't looking for. From a news alert on my phone, an article in the Globe about a real estate deal on the west side. There was a photo. A man in a charcoal suit, standing in front of a building he'd just acquired, looking directly at the camera the way he'd looked at me outside the clinic. like he'd decided the world was a minor inconvenience he hadn't yet bothered to address. I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I put it face down on my kitchen table and went to bed. I did not think about him. I did not think about the way he'd said my name like he was trying it out. I did not think about the fact that he'd taken the umbrella handle from me, gently, without making it weird, and held it over both of us for the remaining 8 minutes, until his car arrived, and how when his driver pulled up, he'd handed me back the umbrella with a quiet thank you that landed differently than most thank yous do. I did not think about any of that. I thought about it constantly. He came to the clinic 10 days after the rain, not for a meeting with administration. He walked in through the front door at 7:15 in the morning, before we officially opened, and I was the one who buzzed him in because I'd come in early to restock the supply room, and Bev wasn't there yet. I opened the door. I saw him. I stood in the doorway in my scrubs and my still damp hair, and I said, completely calmly, "You have got to be kidding me." He looked at me. That same look, registering, assessing, and then doing something complicated that wasn't quite a smile. "You work here," he said. "I'm a nurse here." "Yes." I crossed my arms. "You're Kavanagh Capital. Adrian Kavanagh." He said it the way people say things they know you already know. "I know who you are. The question is what you're doing here at 7 in the morning. I wanted to see the clinic before the official meeting, to understand what we're actually talking about." I looked at him for a moment. "We're talking about 340 regular patients, 12 staff members, and 30 years of community health infrastructure." I stepped back and held the door open. "But come in. I'll show you around." I don't know why I said that. Later, Bev would tell me it was the smartest thing I'd ever done, and also possibly the most reckless. She wasn't wrong on either count. I showed him everything. Not the polished version. Not the lobby with the community mural some local high schoolers had painted 6 years ago. I showed him the supply room where we were rationing bandages, because our last equipment budget hadn't stretched far enough. I showed him the waiting room chairs, half of which had been donated from a church that was itself closing. I showed him the room where we held the weekly mental health drop-in, which had a waiting list of 43 people and a budget of exactly $0 additional. I told him about Mrs. Okafor. I told him about the 17-year-old. I didn't use names, but I told him the truth. He walked through the whole clinic without saying much. He asked 2 questions, specific, practical questions about patient volumes and referral pathways, and when I answered them, he listened the way people listen when they're actually gathering information, rather than waiting to talk. At the end, we were standing in the small courtyard at the back, which was mostly used for staff to eat lunch when it wasn't raining, which in Vancouver was roughly 40 days a year. He said, "Why did you let me in?" "Because I wanted you to see it," I said. "Before you decide what it's worth." He looked at me. The October light was doing something complicated to his face. He looked less composed than he had in the rain, less certain, and I had the strange feeling that this was the more accurate version of him. "I don't usually get shown around the thing I'm acquiring," he said. "No," I said. "I imagine people usually prepare a presentation." "They do. And does that work for you?" "The presentations?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not particularly." We stood there for another few seconds, and then his phone buzzed, and he looked at it and said he had to get to the main meeting. He thanked me. He walked back through the clinic and out the front door, and I stood in the courtyard in my scrubs, in the October chill, and tried to figure out what had just happened. The official meeting happened that afternoon. I wasn't invited. I was a nurse, not an administrator. But Bev sat in on it and reported back to me in the break room afterwards, her coffee cup clutched in both hands like a shield. "He didn't say they were shutting us down," she said. "He didn't say anything definitive. He said his team would be in touch with a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "He didn't say." I chewed on that for 3 days. The uncertainty was worse than the bad news would have been. At least with bad news you can figure out what to fight. I was getting off a shift on Thursday evening when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. "The proposal involves keeping the clinic operational in a redesigned ground floor space within the new development. Ground floor, corner unit, double the current square footage, rent locked for 15 years. I thought you should know before it goes through official channels." I read it 3 times, then I typed, "How did you get this number?" He replied, "Bev, of course. Of course, Bev. I stood on the sidewalk outside the clinic in the dark, reading the message again, and I tried to ignore the warmth that had spread through my chest, which was entirely inappropriate, and also, as far as I could tell, completely involuntary. I told myself it was professional. He was the person whose company owned our building, and he was proposing terms that would save the clinic. Of course I would respond to his messages. Of course I would engage with the process. It was responsible. It was practical. None of this explained why. I laughed at something he texted me at 11:15 on a Friday night, a dry observation about a news story, and then lay awake for an hour afterwards, doing nothing in particular. We didn't meet again for 2 weeks. When we did, it was because he asked, carefully and with more uncertainty than I'd expected, whether I'd want to have dinner. I said yes faster than I meant to. The restaurant was in Yaletown, beautiful, expensive, the kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices on the version they hand you. I wore the nicest thing I owned, which was a green dress I'd bought on sale for my cousin's wedding 3 years ago. I walked in feeling like a poorly matched set and walked out 2.5 hours later, feeling like I hadn't thought about anything except the conversation we'd been having. Adrian Kavanagh was, this is the thing I couldn't reconcile, the thing that kept catching me off guard, deeply, unexpectedly present. In a world full of people who perform attention, he actually paid it. He asked about my work and listened to the answer. He argued with me, pleasantly and directly, about urban development and housing policy, and what responsibility private capital has to public infrastructure. He was wrong about some things and said so when I pointed it out. He was right about other things, and didn't make a big deal of that either. Somewhere in the third hour I realized I was in trouble. Over the weeks that followed, I met his world in pieces. A charity gala in November, where I stood next to him in a room full of people who owned things, and he introduced me not as his date, but as the nurse who'd shown him around St. Clair's, and said it in a way that made it sound like the most important credential in the room. A family dinner at his parents' house in West Vancouver. The kind of house with a view of the water that costs what a small country might budget for infrastructure. Where his mother was politely evaluating me, and his father asked about healthcare, staffing with genuine curiosity. A Sunday afternoon walking through Granville Island, where he bought us both bad coffee, and we argued about architecture for 90 minutes, and it was the best Sunday I'd had in years. I was falling and I knew it, and I kept telling myself to be careful, in the way you tell yourself to be careful when you already know it's too late. Because here's the thing about Adrian Kavanagh that I hadn't fully let myself think through. He lived in a world I didn't, not just financially, though a man whose company acquires city blocks for development exists in a different financial reality than a nurse counting down to payday, but structurally. His decisions affected hundreds of people, and he made them with a certain remove that was probably necessary and was also, occasionally, frightening. He was not careless with power, but he had a great deal of it, and power over that many moving pieces changes how a person occupies space in the world. I was in love with him. I was also at moments genuinely unsettled by what he represented. We fought about it properly once, in February. I'd heard through clinic administration that Kavanagh Capital had acquired another community property on the west side and converted it to market-rate housing, displacing a daycare. I brought it up. He didn't dismiss it, which made it more complicated, not less. I know what those decisions look like, he said. I'm not going to pretend they don't have a cost. And does knowing that change anything? He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him thinking, actually thinking, not performing thoughtfulness. It changes what I do with the knowledge, he said. Not always the decision. But what I do with it, that's an honest answer, I said. I don't love it, I know. We sat with that for a while. It didn't resolve cleanly, things that are real rarely do. In March, something happened that I didn't expect. I got scared and I ran. Not literally. I kept going to work. I kept existing in the world. But I told him I needed space. That I needed to think about whether this was something I actually knew how to navigate, or whether I was just hoping hard enough that the complications would sort themselves out. He gave me the space. He didn't push. He sent one message, one single message, 10 days into the silence, I'm not going anywhere, but the rest is yours to figure out. I hated that message. I hated how much I reread it. Bev, who who had become fully invested in this situation, in the way 63-year-old women, who have seen everything become invested in things, sat me down in the break room one afternoon with 2 mugs of coffee and said, in her particular way that allowed no argument, "Sloane, what exactly are you waiting for?" "I don't know if I can be the person he needs in that world," I said. She looked at me for a long time. "Who said anything about being who he needs? What world do you need to be in?" I thought about the rain. I thought about the umbrella I'd handed a stranger because it seemed like the obvious thing to do. I thought about how he'd stood under it with me, not asked me to move, not been weird about the proximity, just accepted the small shelter of it like it was the most natural thing. I thought about the 15-year lease on our new ground floor space, which had gone through in January. 340 patients still coming in every week. I thought about who I was when I was with him, which was, unexpectedly, inconveniently, completely, myself. I called him on a Thursday in late March, at 9 in the evening. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "I'd like to get that bad coffee from Granville Island again if you're not busy." A pause, then, "Saturday? Saturday works." Another pause, shorter this time. "Sloane, yeah, I'm glad you called." I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed against my ear, and the kale I'd been ignoring for 4 days on the counter, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, like I could breathe at a normal rate. "Don't make it weird," I said. "Never," he said, and I could hear, unmistakably, that corner of the mouth thing that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one either. We walked Granville Island on a Saturday that had the particular quality of early Vancouver spring, which means it was only half raining, and the light was doing something impossible between the clouds. He bought us both coffee from the same kiosk. Mine was still bad, his was worse. We walked along the waterfront and argued, gently this time, more like the beginning of an argument than the argument itself, about whether the new waterfront development on the North Shore was an improvement or an erasure. He said my name the way he always said it, not like a question. "I know this is complicated," he said. "What we are, I know it's not clean. Nothing worth having is clean," I said. He looked at me. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," I said. "It's also a heads up that I'll keep telling you when I think you're wrong." "I know, and I'll be right sometimes." "Often, probably," he said. We walked for a while without talking, which had stopped feeling uncomfortable a long time ago. At some point he reached over and took my hand. Not dramatically, not like a moment. Just the way you reach for something that belongs nearby. The rain picked up lightly, the way it does. Neither of us moved to open an umbrella.